The House is resumed for the budget debate, second reading. Some members seeking the call from the National side. Honourable Nick Smith.
Mr Speaker, the most significant part of Budget 2014 is that we're in the black. That's right. And I'm wearing a black tie to mark that because it is hugely significant. It is great news and a mark of respect for the John Key and Bill English in bringing down in such difficult circumstances a balanced budget, something that is the envy of developed countries around the world. Mr Speaker, let me talk about how significant it is. I still remember, and I brought it down to the House with me, the pre-election fiscal forecasts of October 2008. So this is where Labor have control of the Treasury benches and the officials' advice. And it said, and let me list the figures to remind the House of where we've come from. They said that we would have a decade of deficits. In fact, I checked that, a decade. 10 years of ever-increasing deficits. For the financial year we're debating, they said that the government would be spending in 2014-15 $5 billion more than what it would be receiving in spending. But it gets worse. They said that debt would now be at $80 billion. And even worse, it said that on a business-as-usual basis, carrying on with Labor's policies, by 2020, that debt would be $130 billion. Mr Speaker, that is Greek levels of debt. That is bankruptcy levels of debt. That is the sort of dire state that New Zealand was in 2008. And Mr Speaker, it's not like the intervening 5 years has been easy. The global financial crisis that bit in 2009 was the biggest economic downturn since the Great Depression. In fact, Bill English has had the toughest job of any Minister of Finance, 25 of them, in terms of the global economic circumstances, and then throw on top of that New Zealand's worst ever natural disaster, the earthquakes in Christchurch. Add those circumstances together, Mr Speaker, and you'd say it was a near miracle that we are in the black for 2014-15. Now, Mr Speaker, I acknowledge that's a small number, 360 million. But what's so encouraging is that we're going to have choices in the next 3 years with surpluses of $1 billion, $2 billion and $3 billion out into future years. Mr Speaker, that is an outstanding tribute. And just to get the numbers clear, debt today is $20 billion less than the pre-election forecast from 2008. And in 2020, when the projections would have us wallowing in $120 billion of debt, those debt levels will be back to 20% of GDP, having the New Zealand government's finances better than pretty much anywhere else in the world. And that is an extraordinary achievement for which Bill English deserves huge credit. Now, Mr Speaker, listening to contributions from members opposite, they sort of say, oh, getting the surplus would be easy. Well, Mr Speaker, where have they been for 5 years? Let's go back to 2009 and 2010. Labor members, including Mr Cunliffe, was demanding that there be a greater stimulus package, that the government borrowed more and spent more. In every single area in which this government has done the hard yards to get us in the black, members opposite have screamed and whined and opposed and sniped. Let's get a little example. One of the things that was done with saving was around the issue of night classes. You know what it meant in my ear, and I can remember the constituent constituent in my area earning over $150,000 strongly objected that he was now going to have to pay for his own Pilates classes. Well, sorry, get a grip. Is balancing the books more important, or is the government paying for well-off people's Pilates classes? But, Mr. Speaker, it's not just there. Whether it is in terms of conservation, whether it's foreign affairs, whether it's defence, whether it's been primary industries, across the board, members opposite have opposed every attempt to get this country in the black, and now they have the gall to come to this House and say, oh, getting to surplus would be easy. It is not. It's been hard yards. And, Mr. Speaker, if New Zealand wants to know what it would be like with a Labour Green government, just look across the Tasman. That's right. They just tabled a budget last week of a $50 billion deficit. They're putting up taxes, they're cutting core services, they have got enormous difficulty on their hands as a consequence of the very policies that members opposite advocate for New Zealand, and we say, not on your Nelly, let's keep New Zealand on course and in the black. Now, Mr. Speaker, in this budget are provisions, extra steps around the issue of affordable housing. And I was listening to the budget debate, and there was a contribution from a Green member, and it was so extraordinary I have to quote it. And I said this, what has the cost of building materials got to do with affordable housing? Now, look, I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker, I am one of those practical engineering types. But actually, I've got news for the Greens. Houses are made of things like wood and concrete and plasterboard. And if they are expensive, that makes houses expensive. And if we as a government can make steps so that they might be more affordable, actually, we make houses more affordable. Now, Mr. Speaker, I saw a policy announcement from parties opposite that said that they were going to grant every first-home buyer an extra $2,000, and that was going to make houses more affordable. Well, Mr. Speaker, firstly, where does the $2,000 that the government give away come from? It actually comes from homeowners, from people that are trying to pay the mortgage. It's just the money go round. It's actually not making things more affordable. But I say this, every country that has tried to provide grants and to simply feed the demand side of housing actually doesn't get there. You need to address the fundamentals. You need to go after the issues of land supply, which we're going at pace. And members opposite opposed every step this government took last year with the Housing Accords and Special Housing Areas legislation to free up the process so that we might get more sections available so that houses are more affordable. Tomorrow we're going to be debating the government's changes around development contributions. They've gone up by more than any other item over the last 10 years. Members opposite are opposing reductions in those development contributions and somehow pretend they're about addressing the issues of housing affordability. Mr. Speaker, there is no magic bullet to that challenging issue. We need to do the things the Productivity Commission said we should do. But do you know what I find particularly galling, Mr. Speaker? Every year from 2003 to 2008, house prices went up by more than 10%. One year, Mr. Speaker, they went up by 19%. And what did members opposite do? Absolutely diddly squat. Absolutely nothing. They went up by 96% over that entire period, and there is not a bill or reform in any area that would have made any difference. Reflect on our 5 years, Mr. Speaker. Actually, house prices in New Zealand for the first 3 years during that GFC period went down. In fact, I had questions from members opposite. What is the government doing about the risk of house prices dropping? The worst year was last year. House prices last year increased nationally by 9%. And we've introduced over 6 different reforms to get on top of that issue and to make a real difference. And, Mr. Speaker, they are the long-term real answers to the issues of house affordability. One last point on that question. and that is the worst thing for home ownership and affordability is the issue of interest rates. The budget documents and the Treasury advice is absolutely clear that if you spend like drunken soldiers, you'll drive interest rates up. And they have very clearly put a spending cap of $1.5 billion, which we are following, and every utter I hear from members opposite is that they'll exceed that, drive up interest rates, and rob New Zealanders' hopes and dreams of housing affordability. Mr. Speaker, this is an awesome budget, a good budget in the black, making progress for New Zealand, and it should be commended to the House.
Eugenie Sage.
It was an interesting contribution. And there are a couple of initiatives like the free doctor's visits.